Hello, everybody. Welcome to another interview on History Valley Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor James Charlesworth, and today we're going to be discussing new archaeological finds that relate to the New Testament, such as synagogues and other things that connect to the Talpiot tomb, the Jesus family tomb, and we'll take it from there. Well, welcome back to my podcast, Professor Charlesworth.
Well, Jacob, I'm always pleased to try to share the little any of us know with all those who are interested. And I must say, there's more interest in these questions than in my life experience. I think because people are pouring out of the church, but they're not pouring out of religion and spirituality. They are eager to get answers, but the ministers, they tell me, don't have the answers. You asked me some questions today, and I thought no one can answer them. And in the last hour, I began realizing, wait a minute, I've been involved in every one of these questions trying to answer them. So it's my pleasure to hear your voice again and to try to share with people the tremendous excitement I feel as a Methodist minister and as a critical scholar, and those sometimes clash. I have to be as critical as possible. And I also, when I get on my knees, I realize that, oh my gosh, this has a very strong impact on me. Obviously, I've come a long way since I was 14 and decided to give my life to Jesus. So people will say, that how can you ask such questions? I said, because I've been trained to do that by the best Christians and the best Jews. If we don't ask the hardest questions, we've given up and let others do it. Does that make sense, Jacob?
Yes. And I just want to say that the pleasure is all mine, and I always love having you on the podcast. And that takes me to my first question for you. What kind of new archaeological evidence has been unearthed regarding Jesus' ministry?
Well, when I began to think about this question, I drew a blank. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. I have been arguing on BBC News and elsewhere that we have astounding new insight about Jesus' birth. We know that when we study the Jews in Nazareth, most of them came from Bethlehem or Judea. And that means that the account that he was from Nazareth but was born in Bethlehem makes sense because of the connection. If his family is from Bethlehem, then most likely they would go down there to worship in the temple and go down and see their relatives. So the connection between Nazareth and Bethlehem has become very evident. Now, I have worked in Nazareth, and I have climbed way down into the houses that were just excavated, and these are houses from the time of Jesus. And when I was on BBC TV, I said, look, this is where probably the little boy Jesus played under the houses. They're in the houses, but beneath the floor where you had, a lot of things. Also, that's his youth. We now have a vast amount of evidence about his baptism. At Qasr el Yahud, we have found evidence of baptismal sites and churches, and we now know probably, we're never working with certainty, not as historians. Certainty is people that begin with a statement and then prove it. If you start with a question, you still have questions that can never be answered. But that is scholarship. You ask questions, and what you look for is something that's reliable. Yes, it's reliable. We have found where Jesus was baptized by his cousin John, and I have been there, and I baptized young people there. It's the Jordan River, and we have found very early churches that commemorated the site. Now, the temple is the final thing I'll say at this point. We didn't know much about the temple until when I was living in Jerusalem as a young scholar, and I would go over and I couldn't believe what they were finding. One day I filled a jar full of ashes from the burning of the temple, and it was very moving to me that I was taken back to 70 when the September of 70 when the temple was burned. And then I thought about Jesus, and he was walking around. They opened up many walkways and shops, and I thought about Jesus as a grown man going in this area and moving up into the temple and teaching. And we knew where he taught. It was on the eastern side of the temple, looking toward the rising of the sun. And that made a big impression on me. Everyone today, whether they're Jews or Christians, including agnostics and atheists, that we know where the temple is. We have remains of it. We have a stone, Jacob, that weighs almost 600 tons. And that's a whole new story. You can come back to that whenever you want. How did they move that stone? 600 tons.
Do any of the recent archaeological findings tie into the Talpiot tomb being the Jesus tomb?
Well, I have a book on that, which is the proceedings of the discussion, and it's very controversial. Um, you have people that say and these are deep Christians, and others are Jews, and others don't know what they believe. They said emphatically, "We have found Jesus' tomb." Others have said, "No," and it gets very complicated because when was Jesus' tomb opened and by whom? You have people thinking that it was opened by Joseph of Arimathea and others, and that his corpse was then taken and placed in Talpiot. I have no evidence of that, but I do know the New Testament said he was buried there temporarily. Now, we can't say anything more than that. There's lots of speculation that there's an underground tunnel that leads from parts of Jerusalem up to the Talpiot tomb. And I would have to say, so what? We have no evidence that his body or his corpse, remember, it would be a corpse, he's dead. A lot of people say, no, he's only swooning. That is not the New Testament. The New Testament is emphatic. He died on the cross, and his last words were, Eloi, Aramaic, Eloi lama sabachthani. Why have you abandoned me? So that is the heart of Christian confession. The crucifixion must not be separated from Easter. It occurred at the same place. Where he was buried is where he was raised. And I have crawled down and seen the tombs that people think could be Jesus. I don't think there could be Jesus. Jesus' tomb was nearby, and they built a tremendous shrine over it. And during the Crusades, it was smashed and destroyed. But we do know that there were Jewish tombs from the time of Jesus, exactly where Jesus was buried. Now you say, Jacob, that's not possible. That's within Jerusalem. I would love to show people the exit from Jerusalem. It's just farther to the east. So we're outside of Jerusalem. And the wall that you see, we can date to 44. Think about that. 14 years after the crucifixion. So Jesus could have been buried where these tombs are. And the closest to the tomb of Jesus in terms of description is a tomb claimed to be Herod's family tomb. We don't know where that tradition began, but it is not very early. And so it is a tomb very much like Jesus. So we're seeing that a lot of the New Testament evidence is corroborated by related discoveries.
How much of our archaeological evidence do we have from the time of Jesus that Jesus, uh, that confirms Jesus having visited the places the Gospels mention?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. Let's say 10 years ago, the answer would be We have none. And books were written about Jesus of Galilee, and they say we cannot find one synagogue that dates from the time of Jesus. They take, for example, the Capernaum synagogue is 5th century, maybe 6th century. Well, you can't have Jesus going into a 6th century synagogue. You have to have one from his time. Now, lo and behold, I have a book that I'm about to send to a publisher, and it reveals the discovery of synagogues in Galilee. We have found the synagogue in Capernaum, but beneath it is another building. It's from the 1st century. The houses around outside are from the 1st century, and most likely this is a synagogue because synagogues do not migrate. Where you have a synagogue, you rebuild it, you refurbish it, but you don't move it because you'd have more than one sacred spot, and then you have a problem. Only one place can be the synagogue. And even today, they renovate a synagogue. So we have found a synagogue below Capernaum. And you could say, but Charlesworth, what is the proof it was a synagogue? The proof is how synagogues are built. Now, let's go to Chorazin. We have just discovered under the Chorazin synagogue, this is up on the hills above Migdal. Let's say a 20-minute walk, 30-minute walk if we go slowly and stop and talk. It's not far from Migdal or from the Sea of Galilee. And there is an old synagogue there. And recently, my friends dug. I was there before the digging, and they have sent me photographs, and we're putting it in the book. We have found a building beneath the Chorazin synagogue, and the coins and the pottery date from before the time of Jesus. So it's before the time of Jesus and during the time of Jesus. To repeat, we have found a synagogue in Capernaum and one in Chorazin that are most likely from the time of Jesus, where Jesus could have taught precisely as we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But now I've left the dessert for last. At Migdal, I dug for not a long time, and I don't want to say I'm an excavator. I'm a text man. I translate text. I find text, but I have dug in many places, but I'm not an archaeologist. I did dig for some months in Nazareth, and I kind of referred to that obliquely earlier. But I dug at Migdal many, many years. I found nothing. I did find something that I would have to say people thought it was a synagogue, but it turns out to be a latrine with water running through it and benches, which are toilets. Now we are in Migdal. I didn't find a synagogue. We have just in the last year found 2. And both of them were buried during the war between the Roman soldiers, the 2 future emperors, Vespasian and Titus, and they were covered with dirt by the Jews to protect them. The Jews knew the army was coming. The Roman army was coming. Now remember, this is about 50 to 60,000 hardened warriors. And you've seen enough movies, all of us have, what the Roman army was like. No one had a chance against such an organized and disciplined army. You say, well, what kind of an army did the Jews have? Well, we're getting a little off track, but let me explain. Josephus was the so-called commander. He was not a soldier, but he was in charge of the, quote, army, end quote, in Galilee. When this band of men, farmers with rakes and maybe a few swords, maybe some other weapon, which is not a weapon, a club, face the 60,000 highly trained soldiers, they all fled to their own villages. And even scholars don't know that. But you have to say there was never a war because there was never an army. And what we have found beneath this mud and dirt is an unbelievably beautiful synagogue. We know it is from the time of Jesus. It goes back 100 years before Jesus. And we have found another one nearby. So 2 beautiful synagogues, both of them probably is where Jesus taught. And I have no doubt when we were working there, I am not the archaeologist that excavated there, but I was there doing the excavations, talking and picking up shards and examining them. So I did pick up shards, which means pieces of pottery from the time of Jesus. And I found some elsewhere also. The benches reveal where Jesus sat with Mary Magdalene. Now you're saying that confessioning. Oh, I am not. I'm saying it as a scholar. All the Jews that were excavating there say, of course, that's where they met. In those days, women sat next to men in the synagogue. It was later, like 150 years later, or if you have to have it 200 years later, that we now know that women cannot sit next to men because of their impurity once a month. So we do know I sat on the benches where Jesus sat and where he met Mary Magdalene. And the whole life of Mary Magdalene is very complex. All we know from Luke is that demons were driven from her. For a while, people thought that she was a prostitute because of that. There is no evidence. All kudos to the Roman Catholic Church that have stressed clearly that she was a saint and that she needed Jesus' help. Is there anybody that's listening that think that they're sinless? I'd like to talk to them and find out how they know that. So she was a woman that had a reputation that was not pristine, but I don't know what that means. But it may come from Jesus being the Savior, and he doesn't save the saved. He saves people that need it. And maybe when she made confessions, she exaggerated it. No one today considers her a great sinner, but a great follower of Jesus.
Does the New Testament apocryphal material tie into any of these discoveries? And does the New Testament Apocrypha help us understand the historical Jesus any better?
Well, we have to tie into the whole question. You use this term, New Testament Apocrypha. In Eastern Europe, the Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox have gospels like the Gospel of Mary that we consider not in the canon. Now, the canon was not set. That is, what books belong in the New Testament, what books belong in the Bible. It was not set in the first century or even in the second century, with the exception that at Usha, most Jews decided what was in the Old Testament, Hebrew Aramaic Bible. Now, when we talk about the New Testament Apocrypha, what do we mean? Now, that's one of my specialties, and I have been teaching the New Testament Apocrypha for years. And when you look at it, some of the documents put in there are very early. One of them I would talk about is the Gospel of Mary. One of my students has just published a critical text of the Greek and the English translation, and he argues that in the Gospel of Mary, we have first century tradition that was passed on by oral tradition, because the description of the temple is so different and the view of Jews is so different than in some other Gospels that it must be very early. Now, that is Jesus' mother, Mary, and that is very interesting because we know she was connected with the temple. My biography begins with Mary dancing as a virgin in the temple. And then it begins with a scene in the temple. Virgins were, if they were perfect and pure, Mary's father was one of the leading priests. Mary, Jesus' mother's father, was one of the leading priests, and he led services in the temple. And I hope that's helpful. Now, the Gospel of Thomas is a very complex document. We have it in Greek and Coptic, and during my divinity years at Duke, I would read it every night in Coptic over and over again. And I began very fascinating because people began to say, this is a very early gospel. And I think they were reacting to it was a gospel that was finalized in 125. All right, I agree. It was finalized in 125. Are there sayings in the Gospel of Thomas that are independent? They're not like those in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke. John doesn't come into the purvey because when you look at the sayings of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, they're linked with Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Some of these are very exciting, and some of the sayings that are found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are in better form. I would tell you. Now, if we had hours, I'd give you an example. For example, Jesus says, you must follow me in. How do you follow him? You cannot become a follower or a disciple until you do it. And the Gospel of Thomas says, in tache, which is Coptic for in my way. So Jesus defines it. Now, well, the Gospel of Thomas doesn't clarify, but it makes Jesus' sayings more mysterious and more difficult. Here is a passage in the Gospel of Thomas where we have a saying of Jesus that is not quite clear in the Gospels, but in the Gospel of Thomas, in my way. You must do it in tahe, in my way. So I would say that people who are studying the Gospel of Thomas can say it was finalized in 125, but what are the traditions? What are the dates of them? We know that every gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all the others, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Pontius Pilate, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, all of these are very complex, and they have traditions about Jesus that are both earlier and later. Let me say it again. Some of the sayings in Mark are very early, most of them. But a lot of the sayings in Matthew that are by Jesus, some go back to Jesus, and some have been edited by Matthew and his community. And that's only logical, because if you believe that Jesus was raised by God, you're going to try to clarify what that means to you. And your obligation is to take a saying of Jesus that may be misunderstood and add the clarity in light of the resurrection. Now, critics will say you can't do that. New Testament scholars and others who believe that God raised Jesus from the dead say you must do that or you're not being faithful to Jesus and his followers today. I know we're getting into some deep issues, but I love to do that for your group because I want people to question and not listen to me only, but explore. And it's a wonderful adventure to read the New Testament and to study how did Jesus' life and saying take shape as it evolved over decades and decades. Thank you.
Do you believe we are close to discovering lost writings that may mention Jesus and may even be sources that the New Testament text used?
Well, you're going to expect me to say, heavens no. The answer is perhaps. Let us first mention that after Jesus was crucified, you have burning of villages and cities in Galilee and in Judea from 66 to 70, and the burning of Jerusalem in September of 70. That means all the libraries are gone. That is proof also in the Dead Sea Scrolls. These scrolls were hidden in the caves as the Essenes fled in all directions. So you're having the Dead Sea Scrolls were preserved because the community was burned, but the scrolls had already been hidden in 11 caves. Now, we turn to Papias of Hierapolis. Papias, Papias, of Hierapolis. That's in modern Pamukkale, Turkey. Now, Papias lived between 70 and about 130, and he wrote the exposition of the sayings of the Lord. This is lost it's all lost except for excerpts and compositions by Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, around 180, and Eusebius of Caesarea, about 320. I have been searching for 30 years, and the leading experts in Germany and Israel have helped me. Now, I can tell you, I have found evidence that the sayings of Papias, the 5 books of Papias, the exposition of the sayings of Jesus, were still present in the Middle Ages. Now, Papias has the earliest source who wrote the Gospels. Now, we can't get into that, but he makes it clear who's Matthew and who's Mark. What am I saying? I'm saying that I am still looking. I think we will probably find evidence of Jesus, evidence of other Gospels, evidence of the Gospels we cherish in papyri and in manuscripts. When I've worked in St. Catherine's Monastery and on Mount Athos, now remember, professors are paid to teach. So you have to do this on your free time. And then you have to find money. Well, professors are, you read about these basketball players that get contracts for $20 million. Well, no professor makes $200,000. And it's very expensive. So we don't have a lot of money. It used to be in the 1930s and the 1940s and even the 1920s that professors had tremendous funding because of foundations. But these foundations were by Christians who said we need professors to prove what we believe is true. Now, that's not what any scholar can do. We are not to prove anything true. We are not to go around and saying, see, this is true. That's an evangelist. A New Testament scholar is a scholar. He's asking questions, and that upsets everybody except those who say, gee, I think asking questions is the only way we get insight. So I am still looking for evidence of writings. I'm looking for evidence of Papias, and I have found it in many, in one monastery. It was there in 13th century. Now, there's kind of a rule I've learned that something that was there in the 13th century is still there because you don't have the wars and the problems that occurred earlier, 1,000 years earlier. 13th century is 1,300 years the monastery has been there. So I do go to St. Catherine's looking, and they looking for things, and they're so wonderful to me. These are wonderful men of God, and they sacrifice so much. Where can we find them? I think it could be in a palimpsest. Now, let's listen to the word palimpsest. Palin means it's again, perhaps it's been scraped. So what we have is the oldest gospel in the world in Syriac, and Jesus' language is in St. Catherine's Monastery. And what happened is that around the 4th or 5th century, maybe even 7th century, I can't be sure, some scribes scraped the manuscript so you couldn't read the Gospels and wrote over it in very dark black ink the lives of the female saints. Now, why would they do that? Well, very simply, you couldn't go down to a 7-Eleven or a grocery store or a library and buy some paper or some papyrus or some leather to write on. So you had to use what you had. And what you would do is scrape a manuscript, palimpsest it, scrape off the writing. Now, guess what happens over the centuries? The red ink underneath, it's become red, has begun to come back, and with space age photography, we have photographed it and begin to bring to the surface the sayings of Jesus. Now, one that is so important, and I remember announcing this on television, is the Lord's Prayer. And the Lord's Prayer, Kai me es eneges eis parasmon is the Greek, and do not lead me into temptation. Now, what kind of a God is that, Jesus? You pray to God, don't lead me into temptation? Well, lo and behold, this gospel has Wela taklan lenashona. Now, I'm doing this all out of memory, and that means do not allow us to enter in temptation. So that passage is beautiful. And do not allow us to enter in temptation, but deliver us from the not evil, it's evil one in the early manuscripts. So we now have a better, we can say, my gosh, we can now say the Lord's Prayer as Jesus taught it.
What are your thoughts on the synoptic problem? And do you
Well,
believe the hypothetical Q document existed?
two questions. Uh, Most people have no idea what you're talking about, the synoptic problem. Let me define it. And of course, everybody will say, I would define it differently. Okay, that's fine. What is gravity? You're not going to get 10,000 people to say the same thing. What is the synoptic problem? I would define it this way. Why are Matthew, Mark, and Luke so similar? Why do they see Jesus' life and words as if with one eye? That is synoptic. Optic, is eye with one eye. Why do Matthew, Mark, and Luke see Jesus' life and words with one eye? That's the question, and that is the problem. The answer is very simple. Mark is our earliest gospel. It is written poorly. The connective is kai, which is and Jesus was baptized, and he called his disciples, and he began to, everything is Mark doesn't know however or moreover or but, he only knows and it's a jumble. As we know from the earliest authors, first century and second century, Mark did his best to put it in the order, because he was a scribe of Peter who died, and he didn't remember Jesus. He had never met Jesus. All he had was what Peter had been preaching, and they said, now that Peter's gone, can you put together the good news? And Mark says, what do you mean the good news? Kind of like a gospel about Jesus, and he has nothing about the virgin birth, and also he has no resurrection appearances. He has a prediction. So you begin to see, wow, that's not going to survive. So Matthew and Luke replace it, but they're basing their work on it, and that's why we have a common eye. Matthew and Luke use Mark. Now, I want to say something that that is the position of scholars, and that's what I've taught. But I want to ask some other questions. What do we what do we mean by Matthew and Luke? All people will show me the English translation. Then they'll show me a Greek translation, which is earlier than all of those. Then they'll show me a Syriac one. Then they'll show me thousands and thousands of copies of the Greek Gospel of Matthew, and not one is identical. Now, what are you talking about? We have thousands of copies of each gospel today. Which one is most reliable? And the answer is not one. You have to study this one and that one. That's deep scholarship. And at this point, a lot of people who are Christians say, it's over my head. I don't want that. I want to be told exactly what Mark wrote. No one knows it. We don't have a copy of Mark from the first century. We don't have a copy of Matthew from the first century. We don't have a copy of Luke from the first century. We don't have a copy of John from the first century. So you begin to see why we need scholars to work and trust them as they give us the best version. Now, there's been a revolt within scholars that you take the earliest known copy of Mark and then you put in notes how others disagree with it. I've argued that that might be the best, because what you're reading was a copy of a manuscript that exists, rather than what scholars around the world thinks was in Matthew, and no one agrees with them because scholars are trained to disagree. I hope this makes sense. Now we're talking about synopsis. I have on my shelves a synopsis, Synopsis, which has Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Every little passage is put together in parallel columns. So we teach that in the advanced courses. We study the synopsis. Now you ask, I hope that's helpful. We can come back. Now you said, do I believe the Q document existed? Well, I don't know what that question means. Let me try to define it. Q means quella. How can we explain that Matthew and Luke, when they're not dependent on Mark, have sayings of Jesus that are almost identical? How do we explain that? Let me say that again. How do we explain that Matthew and Luke, in quoting sayings of Jesus not found in Mark, are very similar? The only answer is that Matthew and Luke have used a similar source. Q means quella in German. So the research obviously began in Germany. Quella means source. Now we can get into the whole discussion of that. Some of the British say it's not from Germany. I don't want to get into that. We're trying to be clear. Now, the problem is, where did Matthew and Luke get this source? And it has to be some similar, but they didn't use the same source. Now, this gets very interesting. Are they using a written source or are they using an oral source? Now, we have many Q documents. We don't have Q, I'm sorry. We reconstruct, we don't have a Q document, okay? We have Matthew and Luke where they share sayings of Jesus, and when they call this the Q, the quella, the same source. But there are many types of Qs. When I look at Matthew and Luke, I can say that's Q1, that's Q2, because they're not identical. My conclusion is they do share a source, but they also have independent private tradition that they've worked on. Matthew and Luke were brilliant people, highly trained, and Matthew has sayings of Jesus that we don't have Luke, and Matthew leaves some of the sayings in Luke out, and vice versa. Luke does the same thing. They have sources that are similar, but they also have independent sources. You have been asking wonderful questions, and I hope I've got people excited. We've been here for 44 minutes almost, and you get me excited because I like people who are dedicated because they know something, because they ask questions, and they've trusted their teachers. No one goes to a calculus class and stands up in the middle of it and say, I'm walking out of here because I don't believe a thing you say. If you don't believe something that your teacher is telling you, you shouldn't go to that teacher.
There is one more question I do want to add before we close. Are these are these other sources that Matthew and Luke used? Are you talking about M and L, Matthew's special
Yes,
source and Luke's special
yes.
source?
I tried to avoid that. When you talk about special Matthew, it's called M. When you talk about special Luke, it's L. So the synoptic problem begins with Q, M, L, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And I would add another one that is sources that will eventually become more clear as research continues. With the advent of the computer and what it can do for us and photography, who knows what new methods we will learn. And we're dependent on methods. We're dependent upon being honest. And I said scholars love to argue. That's why you get a better insight, because you have a hypothesis, then you debate it back and forth, and then the group says, let's come to a kind of a theory, which is a hypothesis that's been tested. Now, we don't move from a hypothesis to theory to a law like the law of gravitation. And now we're getting into Einstein. How did he know what he knows? They were astounded. I'll just add this as a note at the end. It's my personal note. Einstein lived just around the corner from where I am. And they asked him, Einstein, what mathematical formula did you use to obtain insight into E, energy, equals mass times the speed of light squared? Tell us your mathematical formula. He looked at them and said, it was revealed to me. So all I can say is that absolute perfect speculation cannot be distinguished from revelation. We all are created imago Dei, in the image of God. And the image of God for me is our ability to be creative and to be independent. And those are my words to you at Christmas. Thank God for the ability to share with you the excitement that keeps me young.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Professor Charlesworth.
Well, my blessings to everybody at Hanukkah, which Jesus celebrated and which his followers celebrated, and Christmas, that is a celebration of the coming into our world of the light from God. And I'll use that term. We have been enlightened because God has sent light into our world. Obviously, I'm a Christian, so I would say Jesus is the light of the world. The problem is you don't live in light, but in darkness until you walk over and turn on the light.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.